Hello everyone, my name is Tessa Kegel and this is part 2 of module 1, an overview of occupational health and safety for HBS 5 OHA. So now we're going to talk about hazards and risks, and we will talk about hazards and risks a great deal over the rest of the course. So when we can think about risk theory, assumes that for every serious disabling work accident, approximately there will be 1 minor injury and 29 incidents of property damage and 300 incidents not resulting in an injury. So these are classified as near misses. As you can see, the possible outcomes for work-related injury from statistics such as these, thus the importance of laws aimed at protecting employees as far as practicable from risks to their health. For example, in Victoria, the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004 sets out legal responsibilities for both employers and employees. Employers must, so far as is reasonably practicable, provide and maintain for employees of the employer a working environment that is safe and without risks to health. Within this context, employers have a responsibility to eliminate or reduce as far as is practicable all workplace risks to health. Therefore, it is important for us to understand the nature of occupational hazards and risks to health and to know how they are identified, assessed and controlled. So on your slide you have a depiction of the safety pyramid, which was developed by H.W. Heinrich in 1931. So now we have a few more definitions. So this time we look to the Standard Australia Risk Management Guidelines, which is the companion to the NZS, to define the components of risk. And the components of risk are defined as, first of all, the source of risk or hazard, the thing which has the intrinsic potential to harm or assist, for example, a dangerous chemical, competitors, government, and so on. An event or incident, something that occurs such as the source of the risk which has the impact concerned, for example, a leak, a competitor expands into or leaves your market area, new or revised regulations, or some measure or observation reaching a particular trigger level. And I guess what I want to point out here is it's not only the physical risks which are considered here, it's also the wider understanding, the wider implications in terms of risk. Next, a consequence, outcome or impact on a range of stakeholders and assets. So for example, environmental damage, loss or increase of profits, regulations, increases or decreases in terms of competitiveness. And then a cause, what or why, which is usually a string of direct and underlying causes for the presence of the hazard or the event occurring. For example, design, human intervention, funding prediction or failure to predict competitor activity, failure or expansion of market presence. And then controls and their level of effectiveness, for example, detection systems, cleanup systems, policies, security, training, market research and surveillance of the market. And then finally, when could the risk occur and where could it occur? On this slide, I'm introducing you to the hierarchy of controls. Now I know this concept is very familiar to many of you. And for those of you who this is relatively new, I've put some information up on LMS and we will be returning to this concept again and again through the course of your ergonomics training. So the hierarchy of controls basically is a way to think about how you put into place protections for workers. At the top of the pyramid, we have elimination. So by eliminating the source of the exposure, this is the best way to protect workers. And if you can't eliminate the source of exposure, you can substitute it. So perhaps you might substitute a harmful chemical for something which is less harmful. Underneath that we have engineering. So engineering is where you might design a machine so that it's completely enclosed and workers don't become exposed. So for example, a paint booth in a car painting business premises. Towards the bottom of the pyramid, we have interventions such as PPE, which stands for personal protective equipment, behaviour-based interventions, which really look at trying to control how workers might do particular things in the workplace, and administrative controls, which are paper-based policy interventions. Now, as we go down the pyramid, we require increasing participation and supervision of workers. However, at the top of the pyramid, there's increasing effectiveness and sustainability because the systems are in place and they don't require participation from workers to enable that they are working and protecting workers. The Australian and New Zealand standard for OHS management systems further defines hazard and risk as hazard being a source or situation with a potential for harm in terms of human injury or ill health, damage to property, damage to the environment, or a combination of these, and risk in relation to any potential injury or harm, the likelihood and consequence of that injury or harm occurring. So the reference for this is the ASNZS Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems specification for with guidance for use. So I think it's really important at this point to consider the relationship between hazards and exposure. So risk really equals hazards plus exposure. So if there was no exposure, there would be no risk. Now the terms risk and hazard are often confused and are used interchangeably. When thinking of hazard, think also of consequences. Risk then becomes the issue of probability or the likelihood of a person being exposed to hazard and the severity of the consequences of that exposure. Now, an example of this, an example of a physical hazard in an occupational context is a constant noise at 95 decibels in a manufacturing environment in which workers spend a full work shift, the maximum exposure allowed for 85 decibels for 8 hours. The risk associated with prolonged exposure to excessive noise in the workplace is the increased likelihood of developing noise-induced hearing loss. Now, this is an example of a common risk matrix. These are often used in industry and we'll need to know about these. So we'll be returning to these as we go through the course. It looks at the potential severity and the probability of occurrence in trying to think about hazards and risks. And I apologise for some of the resolution with that. Not very good resolution on that slide, so sorry about that. On this slide, we're looking at the various categories that hazards are usually grouped in. So first of all, we have chemical, such as asbestos, pesticides, cleaning fluids, poisonous liquids, vapours and fumes. Biological, such as HIV, hepatitis B, Legionella, and a range of other biological factors, swine flu, for example. Then we have physical hazards. So these are noise, heat, and ergonomic, so poor sustained postures, repetitive movements, and also include dangerous machinery, vehicles, and continuous vibration. And then we have the psychosocial hazards, such as harassment, boredom, shift work, exposure to stressors in the workplace, and time pressures. And finally, we have radiation. So this is exposure to radioactive materials. On this slide, we've got a few examples of the hazard and risk relationship. So this is from the CCH Australia publication from 2004. So first of all, we have unguarded rollers on a printing press, and that's the hazard. And then the risk might be that a worker's hand might be drawn in and crushed. So we have the hazard, which is the potential for harm, and then we have the risk, which is the actual harm which might take place. And we also have to have exposure within this relationship. Some of the other examples: electricity is supplied by power cable of a deep fat fryer, cable and insulation is cracked, and then the risk is that the worker may be electrocuted. 45 kilogram cement bags at a construction site being manually lifted into vats, and the risk is that workers may injure their backs. Hazard is a delivery driver is expected to comply with the delivery schedule, which allows no breaks over a 12-hour shift. And then the risk is that the driver will misjudge traffic situations and have an accident because of time pressure and fatigue. Or it could be infected blood in a syringe at a hospital, which was incorrectly placed in a plastic garbage bag. The risk is the needle stick injury, which may result in a puncture wound and potentially infect a staff member. And then the final example we have is the hydraulic car hoist with no indication of safe working load limit, and the hoist may fail due to overloading, resulting in workers' injury. So as you can see, there's a really close relationship between hazard and risk, but for the risk to eventuate, there needs to be exposure. The provision of occupational health and safety services should address the identification of hazards, the assessment of occupational health and safety risks, and the control of these risks within the workplace. Now, at this point, I want to bring up the somewhat fractured occupational health and safety legislation, which is currently covering the Australian occupational health and safety environment. So in Victoria and in WA, each state has its own legislation. So in Victoria, that's the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004. However, the rest of the states and the Commonwealth are covered by the national occupational health and safety legislation. So in Victoria, the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004 provides a structure for employers and employees to manage occupational health and safety within the workplace through the setting up of designated work groups, health and safety representatives, and health and safety committees. Each of these entities has specific roles and functions. And if you reside in a different state and are covered under different you will be covered under different legislation, and you need to check the legislation that's applicable to your situation. Now, down the bottom of this slide, we just have a representation of how the system is supposed to work. So we have legislation which is supposed to be implemented within the workplace. And unfortunately, sometimes there's a failure of this legislation, a failure of this implementation, which might lead to injury or fatality for workers. There might be a prosecution, which provides the impetus for development of more case law, which again is implemented in the workplace, and so on. So there's supposed to be a loop where the causes of industrial accidents or industrial diseases, that there's an investigation, and that we try and develop legislation, develop policy which will prevent some of these illnesses and diseases and injuries from occurring in the future. So there needs to be this loop of investigation and action. The OHS regulatory authorities have a key role in monitoring the performance of employers in meeting their occupational health and safety obligations. The authority provides occupational health and safety inspectors who operate in this role. Again, this will vary depending on where you reside within Australia. Now, it's important to think of occupational health services as being provided within the bigger context of the work environment, where various operational systems and stakeholders exist. Examples of the various stakeholders involved in occupational health and safety within the workplace include employers, employees, unions, insurers, supervisors, the state work body, government, manufacturers and suppliers, importers, OHS representatives and committees, OHS consultants, and finally Safe Work Australia, which was formerly known as the Australian Safety and Compensation Council, and prior to that, the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, or NOSC. Now, there are various models of OHS service provision which exist in our workplaces. These may take the form of in-house services, consultancy services, external services, and project management teams. Now, OHS services may be provided along a continuum of priorities. This continuum starts with the ideal situation, which is the primary prevention of disease and injury. If this is not achieved, then the next ideal would be to intervene in the early stages of disease or injury to resolve symptoms and enable the individual to return to normal functioning as soon as possible. So this is known as secondary prevention. If this fails, then full vocational rehabilitation may be required. Now, this is a diagram of what we've just spoken about. So this is a depiction of the continuum of occupational health and safety and injury management. So first of all, we have risk management, injury prevention, and then primary prevention. So this is where we hope to stop the worker from being injured in the first place. However, if the worker does become injured or does develop disease, we go to early intervention. So this is secondary prevention. The worker may be still at work or maybe off work, but really importantly, secondary prevention should link back to primary prevention, so that if a worker has developed some sort of illness or disease or injury, you need to go back and see what it was that caused it and to try and intervene at that primary level. And then the same goes for tertiary prevention, so when there's rehabilitation, so the worker's off work or might be in a phase where they're returning to work, you need to go back, right back to the very top. How could we have prevented this from happening in the first place? Now, one of the things which we need to note here is that quite often rehabilitation is completely separate to prevention, and we'll often find that there's very little association between the people who are providing rehabilitation for workers and the people who are responsible in terms of primary prevention. So, as health and safety professionals, we really need to be aware of the links and always going back to seeing if we can actually intervene at the source and in primary prevention. So, examples of some of the occupational health and safety services which make up this continuum of OHS injury and management might include developing and implementing OHS policies and procedures, OHS audits, hazards and risk management, health and wellness education. However, this must always be done, it must never be done at the expense of primary prevention of hazards and risks. Early intervention programs for injured workers, provision of first aid, screening and monitoring employees' health for early evidence of occupational disease, and to reduce the potential for aggravation of pre-existing illness or injury. Placing employees in suitable work as part of their rehabilitation, diagnosing and treating occupational diseases and injuries, managing absenteeism, and this may particularly be an issue in terms of the psychosocial work environment, keeping records of injury hazards, etc., inspecting workplaces, managing occupational health and safety emergencies, investigating accidents and incidents, and finally training employees in safe work practices. And again, a reminder that training is at the bottom of the hierarchy of controls. However, in some senses, this may be part of an overall occupational health and safety program, which has elements from some of the higher levels of control implemented at the same time. The primary focus of occupational health and safety is the whole workforce, their work activities, and the workplace environment. The primary focus of occupational rehabilitation is the injured or ill individual worker and the controlling workplace conditions which might aggravate their work-related injury. So any controls which are implemented through the rehabilitation process should decrease the likelihood of future illness or injury for other workers. This brings this module to an end. In this module, you've been provided with an introduction to the concept of occupational health and safety through looking at the 1950s WHO ILO statements and really trying to see how many of these concepts are still central to how we think about occupational health and safety in the current environment. Then we've looked at some of the historical developments of occupational health and safety worldwide, looked at Alice Hamilton, Ramazzini and other historical figures. Then we've had a look at the definitions of hazards and risks and the identification, assessment and control of risks in the workplace. And then finally, you've been provided with a brief introduction to the nature of occupational health services. Now, on the Module 1 site, you'll find a list of readings, which I'll ask you to have a look at before our next Collaborate session. And there'll also be a list of activities, a list of questions that we can discuss in the Collaborate session. These are the list of references that I've used to prepare this lecture.